kind of work off of a structure now instead of just memorizing a random series of chords. We're actually, able to provide reason to why we use each individual chord and think about it within the system. And then again, there's a ton of other benefits. You're able to see common chord progressions and recognize it in other songs, learn other songs easier and memorize songs easier. And, you're also just able to kind of explore, any given key and deliberately see what your substitutions could be, right? Because, I've said this before, to know how to break the rules, I think it's important to know the rules, right? So when you have this nice kind of outline of how the rules look on your guitar, it's really great to see, well, that note's not actually in the key. What can I do with that one note so that, I can create a nice chord progression, but then insert a little bit of tension or something that kind of slips outside of what the listener might be used to. So again, that's our number system, and we've pretty much broken it down throughout each individual week here. We talked about the major keys, we talked about the minor keys and how it's basically just the major keys from a slightly different perspective. And we've also talked about a couple common substitutions, and I'm actually going to go to something that I talked not in the previous lesson, but the lesson before that, which was when I talked about what I like to call the classic rock keys, or the sounds of classic rock. So we're mainly just going to be doing some review in here just so we can look at some of these different ways that we can view our chord progressions. So I just wanted to start we're going to be in the key of E major for this entire lesson. It's, a great guitar key, as all of you probably know. There's a lot of songs in E major, and there's a lot of reasons why we like that key. But I'm going to start just playing the number system, and this is going to be entirely based off of my A string, right? So a root note on the A string. I'm just going to play my number system 1 through 7. And then I'm going to talk about the different variants we have, right? So I'm going to review what I talked about in that other lesson, where within the keys of classic rock, we had, a different version of viewing our number system when we were using the minor pentatonic scale. But for starters, let's just look at, again, our number system based off of our major scale, and I'm not going to do any inversions or anything like that. So again, this is in the key of E. And it's just going to be a chord assigned to each individual note like we've been doing, right? And we're just going to do the triads to start. So we have our E major chord to start, right? The 7th fret of the A string, and then my ring finger barring the 9th fret of D, G, and B. So this is my 1 chord. My 1 is major. My 2 chord is minor. All right, so this is an F sharp minor chord. This is based off of the 9th fret, and I'm barring with my first finger across the A string all the way up to the high E string on the 9th fret, and then using my ring finger on the 11th fret of D, G, G with my pinky, and then my middle finger is playing the 10th fret of B. So my 1 is my 1 is major, my 2 is minor, my 3 is also going to be minor, this G sharp chord, right? So again, it's the same exact voicing I was using for F sharp, just shifted up. And you notice the further and further you go up, you're probably going to have to shift your body shape just a tiny bit, because, this side of your hand is really going to start digging into your side as you need to, really get your hand in position up here. So, if this feels like it's getting a little tight for you, see if you can angle your guitar a tiny bit this way so you have a little bit more reach in coming around. Obviously, I'm not going to do that because then I wouldn't be facing the camera and you wouldn't get to see my fingers. So just note that if it's starting to feel tighter, because it obviously will as the frets condense, just see if you can readjust your guitar and maybe shift it a little bit away from your body. That way your hand has a little bit more wiggle room to really get under those frets. All right, next is going to be an A chord, and I'm actually just going to come around and do my A here now that we've kind of looped around the guitar. So that's the open A string, the 2nd fret of D, the 2nd fret of G, and the 2nd fret of B. All right, so that's our 4th chord, which is major. Our 5 chord's also major, right? So that's the 2nd fret of the A string, and then the 4th fret of D, G, and B. Now I'm going to come up to this C sharp chord. This is my 6, and this is going to be a minor chord. So again, same voicing I was using for F sharp, but now it's based off of the 4th fret. So that's the 4th fret of A, the 6th fret of D, the 6th fret of G, the 5th fret of B, and the 4th fret of E. And I know bar chords can be a little bit tricky for those of you that are just getting into it, but you can see how useful these are because I'm using the same voicing for both my major and minor triads all over the guitar neck, right? So it's really, really useful. All right, and now our 7. And for those of you, again, I just wanted to give a little review on my 7. If I was to just play the triad, it would be a diminished triad. I think the way that I'm voicing these chords, I don't think there's a really nice just diminished triad that lays well. So I'm going to play the full chord that's available at this fret, which is our half diminished chord, or a minor 7 flat 5. So again, it's a little weird that I do this, but I wanted to just, you know, restate that this was something going on, because like I said, I only wanted to give things that I thought were directly useful and applicable and things I actually use in my playing, and I don't really ever play a diminished triad that's going to be, you know, just kind of spaced out here and, you know, not really as useful in my opinion as the other chords. So I'm going to do the full 7th chord now. So this is the 6th fret of A, the 7th fret of D, the 6th fret of G, and the 7th fret of B, right? Our weird one has a lot of tension in it, a lot of clashing tones, because mainly of that tritone, right? So it tells us I want to resolve back up to my 1, right? So again, 1 is major, 2 is minor, 3 is minor, 4 is major, 5 is major, 6 is minor, 7 is diminished, and if we were to do the 7th chord version, which I am in this case, it would be a half diminished chord, or a minor 7 flat 5, depending on what you want to call it. And then I'm back at my 1 chord again, right? So again, I know we've obviously talked about this in pretty much every lesson, but I'll keep restating that it's important to really try to hammer this information into your head, because there are a couple different types of, you know, knowing how these chords lay. One is just being able to, you know, follow the tablature and go, okay, I understand that there's a pattern here. You know, the second is probably being able to memorize that pattern, you know, knowing on any given day that a 4 is major and your 5 is major within a major key, and, you know, being able to apply it to other keys. And then that last step is really having that, you know, which is, you know, that last step I think is the most open step, because there's still a variety in there of, you know, how well you know the system, of being able to just kind of play it on the fly, of someone going play a 1 4 5 in A, and you just go got it, because the number system is so, you know, ingrained in you and such a part of your chordal playing. So I'm always kind of refreshing this information, because, you know, it's not a binary, you know it and then you don't, or you don't know it and then you know it. You kind of constantly reinforce it, and the quicker you get at it, the better and more fluid you are in the system, and, you know, the more you're able to apply it to things that you want to play on the guitar. All right, so that was our standard number system. Now we're going to talk about those 2 inversions that I think are commonly used, and there are other common inversions that happen within our, you know, number system, but I think the 2 most common ones when you're in a major key are going to be the 3 and the 7. And what we're going to do here is we're going to play a first inversion chord. So as a refresher, when I say the term inversion, all of these chords that I was playing were root position. So what that means is if I was playing an E chord, the root note was the E, right? The note that the whole entire chord is based off of. So all these chords I just played were root position, in that the root note was my bass note, or the lowest note on the guitar. And what an inversion says, it says, let me keep these same notes, but I'm going to switch up the order so that the lowest note is no longer the root. And when I say first inversion, it means I'm going to take that next tone within the chord, which is our 3rd. So when I say play a first inversion chord, it says, all right, look at your chord. If it's a triad, it's 1, 3, and 5. I'm not going to put that root at the bottom. I'm actually going to put that 3. And that's what we get here. So when I get up to this 3 chord, which used to be a minor, it's actually going to be my 1 chord, but a first inversion of it, right? So I'm going to take this 3rd, and I want to put it on the bottom, right? So I'm actually going to put it right here, and it looks like this. So this is the 9th fret of D, G, and B, and then my middle finger is right here on the 11th fret of A. And if you want to, too, something I really especially like with this chord, I can also bar right here. And the reason I'm doing that is even though this tone isn't in the chord, I can use it to hammer on, right? And this is, you know, if you ever listen to music by Jimi Hendrix, or, you know, any guitar player that came after him and really developed their style based off of what he was doing, this was huge in his playing. And, you know, it can take something like a 1, 4, 5 progression, which can be cool, and make it super interesting, at least in my opinion, right? So that's kind of the thought process there behind that. We're just taking that third of the chord and we're making it the bass. So what that results in is this is my 1 chord, which is major 2, which is minor, and now my 3 is just my 1 chord first inversion. And you can hear again, the reason that this chord is often used is when I was just doing the normal numbers of 1, 2, 3, you can hear there's a lot of movement in the harmony, right? This feels like a very deliberate place, but when I'm going, you know, it stays a little bit more in place. So if you're trying to come up with a progression that, you know, doesn't move as much, or you want to go back to the 1, but you don't want it to just be, you know, alternating between your 1 and other chords, the 3 is a great option here. So, you know, I'm not going to give an exact percentage of when somebody says 3, it's often this chord, but, you know, it's definitely more than 20% of the time, right? It's a really common substitution that we use. And a lot of times when people say 3, they might actually just mean this chord, depending on the style of music. But for our purposes, we're just going to know that even though the 3's normally minor, we can also replace it with this 1 chord, which stays a little bit more close to, you know, obviously the 1. So we have our 1, our 2, and then this was our 3. All right, now we're going to do our 4 normally, our 5 normally, our 6 normally, and you know, I could also do an inversion for the 6, but for our purposes, I'm just going to focus on the 2 that I think come up most, at least in the styles that I've been associated with, which is 3 and now our 7, right? So when we listen to our 7, it's extremely angular and kind of, you know, sticks out a lot. It sounds different than these other chords, and even though that tension can be very, very useful when you're writing songs, or, you know, when you're trying to create something that has a very interesting movement to it, we don't always want that, right? So even though our 7 creates all this tension and says I want to resolve, our 5 chord also does that, right? And that's why it's perfect that we can do a first inversion of our 5 chord as a replacement for our 7, right? And this one, you know, I would say most of the time when somebody's calling out numbers, I would say I probably end up hearing this in the song more than I actually end up hearing this. So this is an extremely common substitution, to the point where, you know, if someone was to say play, you know, a 7 chord, I might just actually play this inversion because I hear it more often at 7 than this diminished chord, again, depending on the style. So again, it's my B chord, but I'm going to say, let me put this major 3rd on the bottom here. So to play this, I have the 4th fret of D, G, and B, and then my ring finger is going to play that 6th fret of A. And if I want to, I can put in that little hammer-on motion, right? So now I'm going to go through the numbers, but with that replacement at 3 and 7 of those first inversion chords, and again, just the same voicing. So my 1 chord, my 2 chord, my special 3, my 4, my 5, my 6, my special 7, and then my 1 again, right? And you can hear when you play that, you know, it, like I said, it stays in place a little bit more, in my opinion, than when you're doing this, right? A lot of these chords, the 3 and the 7 especially, feel like you're really deliberately moving away from the 1. And now when you do this, I think the progression stays a little bit, you know, more in place. So if you're ever doing pop music, folk music, or something where, you know, you don't want the progression to be moving around a lot, or you're just writing, you know, a piece of music in one section, you want it to stay in place, these are great techniques to kind of keeping that sound a little bit more together. All right, so the other thing that we talked about when we did classic rock was what happens, and again, this is kind of it took me a while to really kind of figure out what was going on, but these are a lot of common substitutions that are used in classic rock music. And basically, what we're going to do here is we're going to play our minor pentatonic scale, which, you know, was probably some of the first scales most of us learned on the guitar. And as we know, you know, if you play rock music, the minor pentatonic scale is, you know, synonymous with classic rock music. It's really a part of the sound, and, you know, in essence, it really, you know, replicates what a lot of classic rock is going for. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our minor pentatonic scale, which is 5 notes, and we're just going to play a major chord, a major triad, at each of those individual intervals, right? And so what ends up happening, let me play it first, right? So this is my 1, this is my flat 3, this is my 4, this is my 5, this is my flat 7, and then I'm back to my 1. So what happens here is really, really interesting in that we're using the same major voicing, right? But I'm also borrowing some chords from the minor sound, you know, this minor third in this flat 7, and it gets to the essence of what a lot of blues music is, where I'm playing in a major key, but I'm also implying a minor sound, right? I'm playing a minor pentatonic and a major pentatonic at the same time. And you can hear it when you listen to really great blues players. That's where this whole entire sound comes from. They'll play a major pentatonic sound and kind of hint at the major sound, and then they'll play a minor pentatonic sound, all within the same key. And using those two sounds together, you know, you have this really interesting dance of saying, am I going to play the major third or am I going to play the minor third? And that dance around that really gets that kind of signature bluesy sound, right? Right, so you could hear I was playing both the major third and the minor third, and I was kind of dancing around both of them and kind of trying to play with that sound, right? So it's really interesting that this is such an integral part of rock music. We're playing almost a major chord and a minor chord at the same time, if you think about it that way, but it's really just kind of playing around with the major third and the minor third, both in the same key. And again, we're achieving that by just using these major triads and playing it from every interval of our minor pentatonic scale. Now, if you were to talk to Angus Young or someone in AC/DC, you know, I don't really know if they would think about it this way, or, you know, I'm sure they use the number system in their own version, but I don't know if they sat down one day and said, you put a major chord at any, you know, given note of the minor pentatonic scale and you get this, right? It might have just been something that they kind of orally picked up as they, you know, kind of went on their songwriting process and took a lot of what they were doing from classic blues musicians. So it's not to say that this is the only way to think about it, but when I learned this, it really helped me understand these substitutions, because the normal number system just didn't fully make sense a lot of times when you were talking about blues. Like, in my mind, I saw, well, there are major keys and there are minor keys, and then there are like blues keys. They're kind of their own territory and they sit in their own place. So it really helped me in my own mind when I could actually think about it this way, right? So again, the other interesting thing here is there's only 5 chords that happen within this whole entire progression or number system, and my 1, my 4, and my 5 are the same exact ones as my normal number system, right? The only ones where I'm stepping out is that minor third, because normally it would be a major third, and that flat 7, right? So it's really only 2 special chords that I'm adding to this progression to really give it this, you know, what I would call a classic rock sound. And again, let me play all of these chords now. I just played them in, you know, this simple bar chord version. Let me play them all now as our first position chords, and just walking up this, your mind just instantly goes, yeah, that sounds like an AC/DC song. And this is really, you know, at the essence of how most of their music worked, and especially all their hits. They were really using this way of thinking where they're taking the minor pentatonic scale and saying, let me play a major chord from every one of these and get this, you know, this blues key sound. So I have my 1 chord, my flat 3, my 4, my 5, my flat 7, and my 1. So I'll just walk up and down this. You can really, your mind, at least my mind, instantly connects to that sound, because I'm playing major chords, right? But if I was to play the major scale over this, it sounds completely out of place, right? It's a little bit too delicate and kind of classical sounding. It really is implying that minor pentatonic sound with also a little bit of that major thirds kind of sneaking in there too, to create some tension, and again, just kind of meet in the middle of this minor pentatonic sound and this major pentatonic sound. So that was what we talked about in that previous lesson, and this is just a review of that. And again, if you said, hey, let's play the classic rock numbers, I don't know if any given person would really be thinking about it that way. This is just to know when somebody says flat 3 or flat 7, it means we're often playing a major triad there, and we're kind of getting at this bluesier sound. So people will often say, play a flat 3 chord, right? Or play a flat 7 chord. And these are the two chords that are commonly played at those individual intervals, even though they aren't obviously within our major key. So what I'd like to expand upon with today with our example is actually we're going to go back to more of our traditional number system, and this one is a little bit in the vein of Blink-182 and the Foo Fighters, which I know some people might say, gosh, is that classic rock? And I don't think about it as classic rock, but I know they play it on the classic rock station, so I figured I guess I'll just fall into that trope too and also call it classic rock. And with a lot of these, if you listen to a lot of like Blink-182 songs, that kind of classic pop punk stuff, they moved really quickly through a lot of their numbers, and they were, a lot of times remaining more in that traditional sense of the number system, right? So you're going to see in today's progression, I'm actually going to not do this kind of classic rock sound, what I think of as just the AC/DC numbers, and I'm actually going to stick a little bit more within this sound where I'm using the inversions and kind of quickly moving around and creating these fast moving progressions that, again, they sound like earworms, and they're really taking a lot from pop music, but they're now putting it in a rock context. And then, I like to think about it as the A section's a little bit more Blink-182, and the B section's going to be kind of Foo Fighters-y, and I'm going to show you some of the cool chords that I love that really only work in the key of E major, and, we'll see the reasons for why. But without further ado, let me actually play this progression, and then we'll break it down together. All right, cool. So that was the progression. So let's talk about what we were doing. Again, we're in the key of E major, and like I talked about, you could hear I was just pretty quickly walking through these numbers and almost just descending through my system starting at 1. So I had my 1 chord, which was E major, just the normal bar chord we were doing before. Then I went to this special 7 chord, right? So this is my B first inversion, or what it's probably more commonly called, B first inversion is a little bit more classical. We would probably call this a B over D sharp, right? So it's just the chord name over what our bass note is, right? And again, in contemporary music, piano players really do call the shots, and a lot of times it is a lot easier as a piano player to think, what am I doing in my left hand? And then what chord am I playing over that in my right hand? So more often than not in contemporary music, you'll see this as a slash chord instead of somebody saying play a B first inversion. It's a little bit more of a classical way of thinking about it. So we have our 1 chord, our 7 chord, which is that inversion, our normal 6 chord, this C sharp minor chord, then to my B chord. So far we've just gone 1, 7, 6, 5. We've just walked down our numbers, right? Then we went to our 4 chord, up to our 5 chord, and then back to our 1, right? And And you can hear when I do this, you know, again, a lot of that music that came out of the 90s and early 2000s, they were all really these earworms, and it's because I'm sticking so closely to this number system and playing something that, you know, it almost could sound like a lullaby or like, you know, a classic folk song that somebody, you know, hums to themselves on the bus. It sounds like something like that, but now it's played in this rock context, and that's how you can almost get that, you know, kind of annoying earworm sound where, you know, someone's singing along aggressively with their own style, but to something that sounds really, really familiar and kind of gets stuck in your head. And again, the other thing I'm doing with my right hand here, you know, this is pretty much coming exclusively from my right hand when you get this sound. What I'm doing, you know, you can hear if this is my quarter note right here, I'm basically doing all eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And you can hear I'm putting that little bit of emphasis in, so I'm mainly muting, but I'm lifting up that mute on 2 and 4. And you can also hear, you know, I do this little, you know, this little extra rhythm here. I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you're, you know, someone that does want to get into this style or kind of learn that, you know, aggressive but really tight sounding guitar that we associate with a lot of the late 90s, early 2000s styles, it's all about selective muting, right, where I'm kind of just letting the guitar breathe out at these certain areas, and then it reinforces the beat. So even when I'm not playing with the drums, right, you can almost hear where that snare drum would be because of where I'm emphasizing it. So again, that's our A section, and kind of in a Blink-182 style, and then this is where it gets a little bit more Foo Fighters-y, because, you know, I just associate these chords a lot of times with some of the Foo Fighters songs. So because we're in the key of E, and I have all of these open strings available to me, I really want to use that to my own advantage, right? And you can create these really dense sounding chords by just utilizing, again, some of these open strings. So this is the first chord that I played. You can already hear it has this kind of beautiful shine to it. So this is an A add 9. And all that means is, or actually I guess I could call it more of a sus 2. So let me break down what I mean by that. So if I was to play my normal A chord, right, I would be playing the 2nd fret of the B string, which is my major 3rd. But I'm actually going to deliberately not play my major 3rd, because if we remember something, the only difference between our major chord and our minor chord is that 3rd, right? So if I don't play it, it makes the chord a little bit ambiguous. And in addition to that, I'm going to replace it with this 2 or this 9, whatever we want to call it, so that it gets this really nice shine, right? So that's the only note that wouldn't be normally in this A chord, but you can hear when I play these two in conjunction, it's really just working as a color tone, right? So in our last lesson, we were talking about Motown music and how we could use all these color tones, you know, just to make the music a little bit more interesting, give it a little bit of a jazzy flair, and, you know, kind of create some pretty resolutions and everything. Well, now we're using, again, color tones, but it's kind of differing up the sound a little bit. I think it sounds really pretty, but now we're using it with, you know, heavy distortion and all this stuff that gives it a complete new context. So again, I'm doing this for my 4 chord. Now I'm going to do this for my 3 chord. So this one, again, it sounds really interesting because I have my B and E string. This is why I love the key of E majors, because of basically these 3 chords that you can play in it. So I'm playing the 4th fret of the E string, I'm playing the 4th fret of D and G, and I'm skipping A, and in doing that, I'm having my first finger just come down on the A string a little bit, so that when I strum through, it's not actually ringing out, right? And then I have my E string, again, ringing out, which would be kind of like a flat 6, or in a way, this is kind of implying that inversion chord we were talking about, right? Because I actually have that B note up there. So I have this. This is my 3 chord. Again, sounds a little bit different than my normal 3. Now I'm going down to this 2 chord. This is my favorite one of the whole bunch. If someone was like, what's your favorite chord on guitar? It's this one. So, it sounds so good. So all I'm doing is just shifting this whole position down and playing the 2nd fret of E. Again, skipping the A string by just having my finger slightly touch it so that when I strum through, it doesn't ring out. 2nd fret of D, the 2nd fret of G, the open B string, and the open E string, right? So what chord does this make? This is basically an 11 chord, right? So it's got my 1, it's got the flat 7, it's got the 5 in it, and then it's got this really beautiful tone, right? It's my 4, but I'm jumping it up the octave, so it feels more like a color tone. And yeah, this chord in my mind just has a very beautiful shine to it. It's got a lot of stacked fourths, which add their own, beautiful variety to a chord. So again, I could talk forever about this F sharp chord, but I do really like it. And we're playing this as our 2, and then we're just back to our 1, right? So again, our normal numbers would just sound like. So now listen to the difference when we're doing all these special, what I like to call the Foo Fighter chords. Right? And we're also doing something really unique here. If you were to play this on piano, someone will go, wow, you're, a very talented voice leader, right? Because you notice that those 2 top notes are staying the same for each individual chord. So it's if you were to play that on piano, it would be kind of maybe difficult to figure out how to keep your 2 top notes the same in each individual voicing. So it's a very deliberate use of voice leading, but it's actually pretty easy because, again, we're just in the key of E major, and I know that my B and my E are going to work within that key. So I can get this really nice and beautiful shine, and again, almost simplify things. So I'm doing something that's kind of complex, but doesn't really sound complex, and is using a lot of voice leading, but I don't really have to deliberately think about it. So we always love when we can play things that, sound really interesting and actually don't have a lot of, technical things that go into playing them. So let's hear it once more over the backing track. Alright, so there you have it. Again, we're revisiting classic rock, and again, maybe we can just call this 90s or early 2000s rock, because a lot of us don't want to think about it as classic rock just yet. But we're really kind of getting at that, Blink-182, Foo Fighters-y sound, where we're now using our more traditional number system again, but with these inversions, so that we can kind of quickly move through progressions and still use color tones, but in a little bit of a different way that has its own unique sound that, again, at least in my ears, I always closely associate with that era. So thanks again so much for watching. We're now going to open it up for questions. Any questions you have about today's lesson, the more traditional classic rock numbers and blues keys, major keys, minor keys, anything I've talked about in this course or anything I haven't talked about in this course that you want me to elaborate on or discuss, please pass those along and I'm going to answer it for you. Let me get back to this first one here. It says, the tab has an E over G sharp chord. Isn't that also C sharp minor 7 over G sharp? Do we know which it is? So there are a bunch of different ways that we can describe a slash chord, right? So in this case, you're saying, isn't it also a C sharp minor 7 over G sharp, which we could in a way say that, but the only thing that happens there is if I'm doing C sharp over G sharp, there we go. So if we're doing the C sharp minor 7 over G sharp, the only thing that gets a little bit confusing there is you'll notice that I'm using this 4th fret here of the A string, right? And that's adding a 4th that wouldn't actually be in that chord. So we could, you know, and in a way, the C sharp minor 7 is really a, you know, it is a slash chord that we could actually use to describe this relationship, but I'd prefer not to, just because that 4th tone isn't really something I was putting in the chord. And additionally, when I say that, you know, the chord is using this, I really want to use a slash chord notation that I think is accurately representing what's going on, right? So even if I was putting that 4th in there, say, and doing a chord like this, what I'm, you know, more so doing is really that inversion of the 1 chord. So I just like E over G sharp because it really plainly describes exactly what I'm doing here. It's saying I'm playing the 1 chord, right? But I'm putting it over the 3rd. I'm putting it over that G sharp. So there are a lot of instances when you are using slash chords that you're going to say, you know, well, I could call it this, but I could also call it this. And, you know, even though there might not be a clear-cut case in every single, you know, instance of when you're using slash chords, I always try to describe it by whatever I think it's actually representing within the music, right? So even though we have a lot of chord synonyms that occur all through music where, you know, there are a lot of shared notes throughout chords, I'm always going to try to say, okay, what am I actually playing here? What is this closest to? And in this circumstance, I was really playing that 1 chord over the 3, so that's why I chose to note it as E over G sharp. All right, so let's see. We got our next question. All right. At the end, you have 3 sus chords in a row. There's a rule that you don't go from a sus chord to another sus chord. Joni Mitchell said she broke that all the time to get a feeling of suspense. Why are you doing this? Okay, cool. So great question here. Why am I playing sus chords consistently? So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what rule that might be referring to. That might be, again, more in the classical realm, because if we think of what sus chords were, you know, originally meant to do, they weren't these kind of chords that we lean on and we spend a lot of time on, right? They were meant to, you know, if I'm doing a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, it was meant to play, you know, my 2 chord, and now my 5, I could make it a sus chord before bringing it back to the dominant chord, and then the 1, right? So it was really this just kind of brief moment where I was, you know, just suspending the resolution, right? That's where sus comes from. It's short for suspension because I'm suspending the resolution. So, you know, when, you know, if you were to take that traditional sense of how we use sus chords, it's definitely not something that we want to lean on, and we definitely wouldn't want to just be going from sus chord to sus chord, right? But the more and more we've developed with music, and, you know, my background, I have a huge love of jazz music, so a lot of times when I'm playing sus chords, I'm actually using it so that I can deliberately not play a minor sound or a major sound, right? And it keeps things really, really kind of open. So when we were using it in this context, even though each one of them was a, you know, kind of this sus chord, I'm still playing a minor 3rd here and a minor 3rd here, right? And I might have described those chords a little bit differently when I was talking about the different intervals, but when I'm playing each one of these chords, you'll notice the minor 3rd is actually in both of these. So even though, you know, a lot of times people like to just notate it as that E sus chord over F sharp or over G sharp, right? G sharp or F sharp. It does actually have that minor 3rd. So in this circumstance, I was really only playing 1 sus chord in that final section. That being said, though, there are other instances where, just like Joni Mitchell said, I love using just sus chords back to back and really going for that, you know, sense of, you know, where is this going to resolve to? What key am I in? So all that to say, she's definitely right. You can break that rule all the time. And even though in this instance, you know, I do think these aren't what I would consider traditional sus chords because they do have that 3rd in them, you should definitely experiment and see if you can put sus chords back to back, because they're so ambiguous. You can really do a lot of movement and cool harmony, because again, that resolution is delayed and it's deliberately ambiguous, so it could be a minor chord, it could be a major chord, who's to say? All right, we've got another one. Let's see. All right. In B, are you just playing the quarter notes straight or embellishing? So in that one, you could hear I was actually varying it up a little bit each time. So I wrote it pretty much as straight quarter notes, because sometimes I find if you're trying to be a little bit too literal with tablature, especially when you're doing something that's kind of rock or blues oriented, it can come off a little bit, you know, it'll seem a little bit more intimidating than it actually is. So instead of doing those straight quarter notes, I was kind of doing what I would maybe consider almost a traditional strumming rhythm for like folk music or something, but with that distortion. Right? So if I was to kind of notate what the exact pulse would be, you know, it would involve some eighth notes and, you know, some eighth rests here and there and some delays. But the overall pulse of it, you could hear in contrast to the A section. Right? That A section is a lot more eighth note based, and this is, it really has that more halftime feel and quarter note bass. So that's why I used the quarter notes to notate that. Again, you can try to replicate exactly what I was doing if you want. Right? I was really just trying to use an open sound and remove a lot of the muting from my right hand so the guitar could breathe, but the pulse is much more that of a quarter note instead of an eighth note like that A section. Okay, and I see we got one more. With regards to the C sharp minor 7, I meant X1199X, same exact notes as the E over G sharp. Okay, so this is a clarification of the previous question. So let me see if I can see what this means. So you're saying 11, or you saying, with regards to C sharp minor 7, I meant to say. Okay, so they're saying, with this voicing that I was doing here, couldn't I say that this is, you know, a C sharp minor 7, right? Over G sharp. And again, you know, just to get back to my original point there, I could say that, but that's not really what I'm doing here. And again, that actually doesn't really account for the C sharp either, right? Because there's not, there's actually not going to be like that C sharp in the E over G sharp, right? Even though if somebody said play a C sharp minor 7 and your bass player was playing a C sharp and I played this chord, right? It would work well over that. But in my E over G sharp, I'm actually not playing a C sharp, so that note isn't actually going to be within it. So again, that gets back to my original point just in a different way, because that would be, you know, a little bit of a different chord. But again, even so, because, you know, I could add that note, I could say, you know what, this actually sounds kind of cool. But when I'm playing that that inversion at the third interval, I'm really trying to say, what in my essence am I doing here? And when I'm thinking about this substitution, I'm not really thinking about it as my 6 chord over the 3, and then I'm not really playing that root note of the 6. I'm really thinking about it as my 1 chord, but over this G sharp note, right? So that's my thinking behind that. And again, I always, when I'm using slash chords, I just try to be as close to what I'm actually harmonically doing as possible. So when I'm playing this, I really am playing that 1 chord and just inverting it. And that's what I hear in my head. But again, if it makes more sense for you to think about that as a 6 chord over your 3, you can definitely do that. Again, I just try to stay a little bit more close to what I think I'm actually doing, and also in instances where, you know, there might be a note that actually is missed out, like that C sharp, I tend to avoid that. All right, cool. And let's just see if we have any other questions. I believe that might be it. So, yep, I believe that's it. So, thank you so much again for making it all the way to the bitter end with me for this lesson. Again, all of this stuff is really, you know, it depends on you just kind of going back and trying to reinforce all of this information, you know, as I've described throughout this lesson and obviously all of these lessons. Learning music theory and really ingraining this number system is a gradual process. It's not a binary on and off. So as you learn all these progressions, feel free to consistently go back to the previous lessons, the previous tablature that are in the lessons, and see if you can can really, develop your own sound and figure out what's going on in your guitar, because the whole point of this is not to just do a couple of exercises and then have it be separate from your music. Ideally, this is something where you can really learn these chord progressions, become familiar with these chord progressions, and have the number system, be something that's ingrained in your life and makes it a lot easier to think about music. So again, thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next lesson.